Welcome to the deep dive. Today, I want you to step back in time with me to a world that feels, well, really alien to how we live now. Imagine choosing to live your entire life, literally, in one single small room, permanently attached to a church. You just can't leave. Your only real connection to the outside world is through a couple of small windows. What kind of person makes that kind of vow? Such a profound, solitary choice. And maybe more importantly, what kind of wisdom could possibly come out of a life like that? That's the fascinating kind of radical world we're exploring today. These Christian recluses, known as Anchorites and Anchoresses, the word itself, anactorus, it's Greek for to withdraw. And believe me, these individuals really withdrew into permanent enclosure, a life of intense devotion, intense prayer. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack their history, what their unique daily lives were actually like, and the surprising cultural impact they had. We'll zoom in especially on one of the most famous anchoresses, Julian of Norwich. We want to understand how someone who was basically dead to the world could become this living source of wisdom and hope that's lasted for centuries. I mean, it's a philosophy of living that challenges everything we think we know about connection and isolation, right?
It absolutely does. And what's really fascinating here is the paradox, isn't it? This extreme physical withdrawal. It wasn't actually about cutting ties. It seems that allowed for this incredible depth of inner exploration and, surprisingly, public service. It just fundamentally challenges our modern ideas about isolation, shows how deliberately cutting yourself off could, counterintuitively, maybe foster a deeper spiritual and even community connection.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea. So, okay, let's start with the basics. Who exactly was an anchorite and what made them different from, say, a hermit just living alone out in the woods?
Well, yeah, at its core, an anchorite, or anchoress for a woman, was a Christian religious recluse. That much is true. But the key difference from a hermit was this specific, lifelong vow of stability of place. Hermits might wander, right? But anchorites committed to permanent enclosure in one spot, a small cell called an anchorhold. And these were almost always built right against a church wall. It wasn't just a retreat, it was like an architectural and spiritual joining with the community's heart. And another thing, unlike monks or nuns in a typical monastery, anchorites often had a certain autonomy. They usually answered directly to the local bishop, not necessarily an abbot or prioress.
Okay, so it's a remarkably personal commitment, but also very public in a strange way. And it wasn't just, okay, I'm moving in now. There was this powerful, almost unsettling ritual, right? Sometimes called a living funeral.
Sure.
Can you maybe paint a picture for us? What would that have felt like going through that ceremony?
Oh, it was deeply symbolic
Hmm.
and quite dramatic, really echoing the funeral rites, the rites for the dead. The person, sometimes they were even dressed in what was essentially their burial shroud, would process into the church. Then a mass would be said for them, marking them quite literally as dead to the world. After that, they'd enter their little cell, and often a small door would be ceremonially sealed, bricked up sometimes, behind them. You might have the bishop pronouncing the office of the dead, maybe even sealing the wall with his own ring. It signified this profound spiritual death and simultaneously a rebirth into this new enclosed life. For anyone watching in medieval times, it would have been a really stark, physical cutting off from their old life, a moment of huge gravity.
Wow. Talk about commitment. And this living space, the anchorhold, it wasn't just a simple box, was it? You mentioned it was built against the church. It had some very specific, almost clever design features that tell us a lot about their life.
You're absolutely right. They were typically small, yeah, maybe only 12 to 15 feet square, built right into the church structure. But despite being austere, they were quite ingeniously designed with usually 3 specific windows. Each one served a really critical function, almost like spiritual interfaces. First, you had the hagioscope, or squint. This was a small, often shuttered opening facing directly into the church sanctuary. It let the anchorite see the altar, hear the Mass, and importantly, receive the Eucharist. That was their direct line, their spiritual connection to the divine services.
Okay, so that's the connection to God. What about the other 2 windows? How did they connect outwards?
Right, the second window usually faced the street or the churchyard. This one was often covered with, say, a translucent cloth. It let light in, but it was also the communication point. This is where the local people, the townsfolk, would come to seek the anchorites' advice, their counsel, their prayers. It was the link to the human community. And then finally, there was usually a third window, or maybe just a hatch. This connected to where a servant could access the cell from outside. This was purely for practical needs, delivering their very frugal meals, like bread and water or ale, and removing waste. It kept them alive physically without breaking that spiritual enclosure.
That 3-window design, It's such a powerful image. It completely reframes what you might think of as isolation, doesn't it? It shows they were physically removed, definitely, but spiritually and even socially, they were plugged right into the heart of things. Still, even with those connections, the daily life sounds incredibly austere. Just physically surviving must have been tough, let alone mentally.
Oh, it was certainly a life of extreme austerity,
Hmm.
very frugal meals, like you said, bread, water, maybe a little cheese or ale sometimes, enduring the cold, the damp, illnesses with remarkable fortitude. There were even accounts, of anchorites so committed they refused to leave their cells even when the church was burning down or being pillaged. They chose to die there rather than break their vow, which raises that important question you touched on. How could this life be seen not just as a prison, but as a spiritual womb? The paradox lies in the purpose, I think. The anchorhold was understood as this physical crucible, a place for an intense journey towards union with God. It acted as a kind of spiritual and geographic focus for the whole society. They were, in a way, the spiritual heart pulsing away in the center.
A spiritual womb for the community. That's a profound way to think about it. Okay, to really bring this home, let's talk about Julian of Norwich. She's probably the most famous anchoress, and her story gives us an incredible window into this life.
Julian of Norwich, yeah. Born around 1342, maybe a bit earlier. She really embodied this life. And think about the time she lived through the Black Death. Wiped out huge parts of the population. The peasants' revolt caused massive social upheaval. She was enclosed at St. Julian's Church in Norwich. That's likely where she got her name sometime after having these absolutely pivotal mystical experiences in her 30s. Her life really shows how incredibly impactful a physically constrained existence could actually be.
And what did her day actually look like inside that anchor hole? We have some rich source material writings about her that almost let us peek inside, don't they?
We do, and it's remarkably vivid when you piece it together. Julian would likely rise before dawn, probably woken by the church bells ringing for matins, the first prayers of the day. She'd kneel at her prayer niche, that church window, the squint, maybe glimpsing the candles on the altar, joining the monks' or priests' chants with her own whispered prayers. After Mass, perhaps she'd turn to her writing desk. We know she wrote, laboring by dim light over her revelations of divine love. And this was a huge undertaking. It's not just the first known book written in English by a woman, it's a profound piece of theology. She apparently didn't write quickly. These were words for deep thought. Words she famously said were, "For the comfort of souls I shall never meet, yet who are as near to me as breath."
Wow. For the comfort of souls I shall never meet. That's incredibly moving. And it brings us right to that second window, the street window, where she connected with those souls, didn't she? Where her wisdom became a public service.
Exactly. By midday, or perhaps at set times, townsfolk would often gather at that street window. The sources suggest these poignant scenes. Maybe a mother grieving a child lost to the plague, seeking some kind of solace, or a merchant weighed down by guilt over dishonest dealings, needing spiritual guidance. Julian would listen patiently, offer comfort, promise her prayers, and crucially, she'd remind them of God's boundless mercy. She apparently assured one merchant there is forgiveness always. Her influence wasn't like some ghostly, remote thing. It was very real, very grounded. As one source puts it, Norwich knows her not as a ghostly recluse, but as a living anchor of wisdom.
A living anchor. That's perfect. He sounds like this quiet, steadfast presence in really turbulent times. And even her basic needs, the food, were so minimal, yet she kept up this intense spiritual and intellectual work.
She did. Her servant tradition sometimes names women like Sarah or Alice would bring those frugal meals, bread, ale, maybe some cheese, through the servant's hatch. Julian would accept them quietly, gratefully, then likely return to hours of meditation. Contemplating the crucifix, we imagine, reliving those 16 mystical showings or visions she'd received during a near-fatal illness back in 1373. She apparently described entering a stillness so profound that time itself seemed suspended. Deep contemplation.
And then, as the day drew to a close, her world shrinking back to just that small space.
As the sun set,
Yeah.
yes, she'd kneel again for vespers, the evening prayers, joining the church chants perhaps with her own whispered psalms, final devotions before resting, praying maybe for everyone who'd come to her window that day. And the cell itself held this immense dual symbolism for her. She famously reflected, "This anchor holds my grave, yes, but also my womb. From here," she felt, "God shows me truths I could never see in the wide world." And she'd often fall asleep, we like to think, whispering her most famous assurance, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well."
That image of her three windows connecting her to God, the community, her basic needs. It's such a concrete way to grasp her daily life. It really brings the abstract idea of an anchorite to life, making it so real. But what's truly amazing is what came out of that quiet, confined life. The writing, the insights.
That really is the crux of it, isn't it? This daily existence, which looks so restrictive from our perspective, was actually incredibly active and generative. It wasn't passive isolation at all. It was a deliberate, focused spiritual work that produced one of the most significant theological texts in the English language, and it had tangible impacts on her community then, and ultimately on Christian thought worldwide.
Hmm.
Her life is just this powerful testament to the idea that deep insight, profound wisdom can be cultivated even within the most confined spaces.
And those writings, those incredible insights, they were born from this deep inner work, this practice we call contemplation. Now, this wasn't just thinking really hard. Love it. How did contemplation in this specific religious context differ from just, ordinary thinking?
Right. In a religious context, contemplation is understood as something significantly beyond just intellectual thought or problem solving. It's more like a practice seeking a direct awareness and experience of the divine that actually transcends the intellect. It's a kind of spiritual seeing or knowing. The word itself, contemplation, comes from the Latin contemplatio, meaning to gaze at or observe. This was often used to translate the Greek word thuria. Now, in Eastern Christianity, the thuria can mean something like a full vision of God, often achieved through intense ascetic practices like hesychasm, focusing on stillness and prayer. In the Western tradition, it's very closely related to mysticism, experiencing God in a way that goes beyond or bypasses our normal rational understanding. It's less about what you're thinking and more about who or what you're opening yourself up to.
So it's about experiencing, not just analyzing. It reminds me of that incredible line from The Cloud of Unknowing, another 14th century English mystical text, contemporary with Julian, that says something like, "We can't think our way to God. He can be loved but not thought." That really seems to capture what you're describing about the anchoritic experience. It's almost about cultivating maybe a content-free mind that's just directed towards God.
Precisely. Or perhaps a mind filled with the awareness of God's presence, rather than filled with discursive thoughts about God. It's about cultivating this awareness of God as a living, immediate reality. And for Julian, this profound inner work was really catalyzed by those 16 mystical showings or visions she received back in 1373 when she was about 30 and thought she was dying. These intense, direct experiences became the wellspring, the source material, for her deep theological reflections. She worked on them for decades, eventually producing the much longer version, the long text, of her revelations of divine love.
And her theology, coming from this woman enclosed in a cell, often felt quite revolutionary for her time, didn't it? What were some of the most groundbreaking ideas that came out of this contemplative life?
Where her most central and maybe the most comforting theme was her vision of God as pure, unconditional love. It's beautifully summed up in her famous line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well."
Mm.
She relentlessly emphasized God's boundless mercy and gave this ultimate assurance of reconciliation, which was a remarkably optimistic vision in a time filled with plague, war, and despair. Another idea, which was definitely controversial for her era, was her concept that sin, while obviously tragic and harmful, was somehow behoovely, meaning necessary or instrumental. She seemed to suggest it played a role in leading humanity to self-knowledge and a deeper, more humble dependence on God's grace. That was a really bold theological move back then.
And the idea of Christ as mother that still feels incredibly radical and also deeply comforting even today. What was she getting at with that?
Yes, she used this powerful, tender maternal imagery for Christ. She described Christ as nurturing, feeding, protecting souls, like a mother who would never abandon her children. For her, this wasn't just a nice metaphor. It seemed to be a deeply felt theological insight born directly from her contemplative experience. It emphasized Christ's compassion, his intimate care, his vulnerability alongside his power. And while her core doctrine was always rooted in Orthodox Christian belief, she consistently leaned towards his hopeful vision of salvation, stressing divine compassion far more than divine wrath. It was truly a theology born of profound, intimate experience, and it has shaped how people understand divine love for centuries since.
So it wasn't just about enduring the cold or the loneliness in that cell. It was about this incredibly intense, almost unimaginable inner life, this mind directed towards God. And that inner world paradoxically produced such revolutionary outward-looking ideas like Christ as mother. Amazing.
Exactly. And For medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, the highest form of human life was considered the contemplative life, especially when that contemplation bears fruit that can be communicated to others. Julian of Norwich is just a perfect living example of this principle. Her revelations, born in that deep solitude, ultimately became a cornerstone of English spirituality and Christian mysticism more broadly. They influenced countless individuals and reshaped how divine love was understood for centuries. Her life really makes a powerful argument for the public value of deep personal reflection.
It's just incredible to think that this one solitary life could have such a far-reaching impact. And Anchoritism itself, this practice, it has a long, rich history, doesn't it? It wasn't just Julian. When did this whole thing really take hold?
Oh, it has deep roots. The practice seems to have first appeared in the Eastern Church, maybe as early as the 3rd or 4th century, with the Desert Fathers and Mothers figures like St. Anthony the Great. From there, it gradually spread into Western Europe. It became particularly popular in Anglo-Saxon England and then really flourished throughout the High Middle Ages from maybe the 11th century onwards. In fact, the practice probably peaked between the 12th and 14th centuries, especially in England. And it's fascinating to note that female anchorites, the anchoresses, consistently outnumbered the men, sometimes by as much as 4 to 1 in the 13th century. It seems it offered a unique path to spiritual authority and influence for women in what was, let's face it, a very patriarchal society.
Right, so women, in particular, found this unique and powerful spiritual path through enclosure. But the practice didn't just carry on indefinitely, did it? When did it start to fade out?
No, it largely came to an end, at least in England, with the dissolution of the monasteries, ordered by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1539. That swept away the structures that supported them. Changing religious ideas across Europe, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation also contributed to its decline elsewhere as new forms of religious devotion and community life emerged.
And yet, Julian's influence specifically seems to have only grown over time, centuries after her death, and the decline of Anchoritism itself.
Absolutely, it's quite remarkable. Julian is now widely recognized as one of the greatest English mystics, often put alongside figures like Marjorie Camp, another important female mystic from that era, who actually visited Julian for counsel, which is amazing. Julian's work, her revelations, was relatively unknown for centuries, preserved in just a few manuscripts, but it was rediscovered and gained prominence in the 20th century. Since then, it's inspired theologians, poets, writers, and countless ordinary spiritual seekers around the world. Even Pope Benedict XVI praised her a few years back as a profound model of trust in God's providence, highlighting how timeless her message is.
And that central message, all shall be well, it just resonates so deeply today, doesn't it? Especially when things feel uncertain or chaotic. It provides this touchstone of hope.
It truly does. I think the enduring legacy of Julian of Norwich perfectly encapsulates that paradox of anchoritism we talked about earlier. Though she was enclosed, technically dead to the world, she became this vibrant living voice of hope and profound assurance that echoes across centuries. She offers wisdom that continues to comfort and challenge us right now.
It's incredible how a life lived in such tiny physical confines could radiate such a massive spiritual and intellectual impact. It really makes you rethink what it means to be influential, doesn't it? Maybe it's not about how wide your reach is physically, but perhaps how deep it goes.
That's a great way to put it. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is that even today, there's a kind of modern interest in reviving aspects of that anchoritic spirit. You hear about urban hermitages sometimes, or people creating intentional spaces for deep contemplation within their busy lives. It really speaks to this timeless human need, doesn't it? A need for a profound spiritual focus, for inner work, amidst the noise and rush of modern life. It proves that Julian's wisdom isn't just some historical artifact. It continues to speak directly to our contemporary needs.
What an incredible journey we've taken today. We've really explored the radical commitment of these anchorites and anchoresses, this form of spiritual dedication that saw people willingly enclosed, dead to the world, yet somehow serving as these vital spiritual anchors for their communities. And through the lens of Julian of Norwich, we've seen how such a life, lived essentially through three small windows, could transform intensely personal mystical visions into enduring theological wisdom, offering a message of unconditional love and ultimate well-being that remarkably still resonates today.
hmm And perhaps as we close out, just consider Julian's profound experience of her cell as both a tomb and a womb, a place of death, but also rebirth and gestation. Think about the spaces in your own life, maybe those that seem restrictive or unpromising, perhaps as a daily commute, maybe a quiet corner of your home, maybe even an unwelcome period of solitude or limitation. Could any of those places actually be crucibles for profound personal growth, for revelation, or maybe deeper connection if you approach them with a similar spirit? with that kind of contemplative purpose? What unseen truths might emerge for you from such a place?